The war in Ukraine is headed pretty quickly, just in a few months, to its third full year, to completing its third year, heading into its fourth year. And there is, heading into its third full year, I should say. And there is not only no end in sight, but this war, which has always been dangerous from the start, because it involves the country with the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet, which is Russia, on one side, and the United States, the second largest nuclear stockpile on the planet, on the other, two countries that have previously brought the war to the world to the brink of an extinction-level nuclear Armageddon. This war is only getting worse. It's only getting more unstable. It's only getting more dangerous. It's also getting worse and worse and worse for Ukraine. Originally, the claim of Western leaders, including Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, the entire Democratic Party, much of the West, was, oh no, we're going to stay in this war until the very end. And the end is defined only by one thing: total victory. And by total victory, we mean the expulsion of every single Russian troop from every centimeter of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, which the Russians annexed in 2014 following the US and Western-backed coup that removed the democratically elected leader of Ukraine and replaced him with someone chosen by Victoria Nuland. And because of its access to the Black Sea and its general strategic value to Russia to guard against attacks by the West, they regard Crimea and attempts to take away Crimea from them as existential. They would absolutely use nuclear weapons to prevent that, like any nuclear power would if they feel that there's a war against them to take something away from them or to threaten directly the survival of their country. So the definition of victory from the beginning was impossible. Russia would not give up Crimea. They would use nuclear weapons beforehand. And the idea that the US and NATO are going, and Ukraine are going to expel Russian forces from this country is preposterous, always has been, and especially is now, given that Russia continues to advance westward to chop up and eat up more Ukrainian territory as the Ukrainian front line just continues to collapse for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that Ukrainians no longer want to fight in this war. There's no fighters left. The ones they forced to go to the front line at the tip of a weapon are completely untrained. They're not fighters. They get eliminated very quickly. They know they're being used as cannon fodder. It's a very grim situation. And the Western response is not to try and facilitate a diplomatic resolution to get out of this war and to get it stopped. It's the opposite. It's to keep escalating every time things get worse. Here from the New York Times today, Russian forces are stepping up attacks on a strategic city, Ukraine says. So it's not coming from the Kremlin, it's coming from the Ukrainians themselves. And this has been going on, this warning, for a long time, and now the Russians are there, and it's a crucial strategic city. Bombardments are increasing in and around Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine, with water supplies now out, while Russian troops simultaneously press a new counterattack in the Kursk region, which is the part of Russia that Ukraine is occupying, thinking that Russia was going to divert all its troops there, and that would fortify the Ukrainian front line, and none of that has happened, obviously. Quote, warning that Russian troops are now on the city's doorstep. About 5 miles away, officials renewed called for all residents to evacuate. The city's population has dwindled from around 62,000 at the beginning of August to 18,000 people by Wednesday, local and regional authorities said. At the same time, Moscow's forces are now pressing a counterattack toward Ukrainian positions in the Kursk region of Russia. President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine said on Thursday that statement came after posts on social media by Russian military bloggers and commentary by analysts that Ukraine had lost control of several villages in recent fighting. Those who remain in Pokrovsk now must rely on water from wells dug near apartment blocks, according to residents. Already much of the city is without natural gas or electricity. Quote, the situation is dire and won't improve anytime soon, said the head of the Ukrainian military administration for the Donetsk region. And he said that in a post on the Telegram messaging app of the loss of water in Pokrovsk. Quote, leaving is the only smart option. So it's just a question of time before the Russians take over the city. One of the reasons why this town is so important strategically is because the Ukrainians use the rail that passes through it, uses the roads that passes through it to supply their troops that are fighting in eastern Ukraine. And there's a very good chance that once the Russians take over the city, those supply lines will collapse. And there's also a good chance that Ukrainian troops that form the front line in eastern Ukraine might actually be encircled by Russian forces. Nothing looks good from a Ukrainian perspective in this war, nothing. And that's the Ukrainians saying that themselves. Here's The Economist from earlier this month, quote, danger in Donbas as Ukraine's front line falters. Russian fighters are trying to encircle the defenders. Quote, if you imagine that the front lines in Donbas are well defined, you should think again. Alexander, an officer with Ukraine's 79th Brigade, watches the battlefield near the front line town of Kharkov on control room screens every day. The Russians are mostly in front of Ukrainian positions, he says, but sometimes cause havoc kilometers behind them. For the wretched pairs of soldiers in scattered positions at the edge of what he calls the kill zone, it is more often not a one-way mission. As many as 18 soldiers might die to dislodge 2 war-hungry Ukrainians, but eventually they will. Quote, we are exchanging lives and territory for time and the opponent's resources. Recently, the Russian pressure has grown more insistent and wider, spanning a front from Pavlovsk to Volodar in the south. This Ukrainian soldiers believe is evidence their enemy has been reinforced with new reserves. The wide front gives the Russians more options to attack, said Mike Temper, the nom de guerre of a mortar battery commander with the 21st Battalion of Ukraine's separate presidential brigade. Quote, they are using their numerical advantage to see gaps in our defense and develop where they can. So these are very reliable sources if you want to look at things from a Ukrainian perspective. This is coming from media outlets that are vocally in favor of fueling the war in Ukraine. The New York Times and The Economist are coming from Ukrainian sources warning of how much advances the Russians are making, how brittle the Ukrainian front line is, how it's only a matter of time before they expand more and more. And in the face of that, you would think that the West would start contemplating how a peace deal can be forged, how some kind of resolution to this disastrous war for Ukraine that's destroying their country, eroding their population, taking on an entire generation of people who are forced to the front line, how this war can finally end. I know the West loves this war. They think that they're being clever, they don't have to die in the war, they just send unwilling Ukrainians to die in it, and they're weakening Russia. And I've said from the beginning, from February of 2022, that the goal of the United States, the goal of the West, is not to save Ukraine. The goal of the West, the goal of the United States, is to sacrifice Ukraine on the altar of their own geostrategic interests in weakening Russia. And not only weren't they going to save Ukraine, it was going to be destroyed. It was just a question of time, given just on the size issue alone. And in the face of all of that, here's what Joe Biden, whatever that means, or whoever that now refers to, is going to do. Quote, Biden is poised to approve Ukraine's use of long-range Western missiles in Russia, long-range weapons in Russia. Quote, President Biden appears on the verge of clearing the way for Ukraine to launch long-range Western weapons deep inside Russian territory as long as it doesn't use arms provided by the United States, European officials said. Now, that whole formulation is very odd to me, that Joe Biden appears on the verge of clearing the use of European weapons, Western weapons, deep inside Russia, as long as it's not arms provided by the United States. Why does Joe Biden have the power to determine how the weapons that are provided by the Europeans are used? The obvious answer is because the European countries are vassals of the United States. They do what we tell them to do. So what Biden is essentially saying is, I'm no longer going to object or ban or stand in the way of Europe, our NATO allies, providing long-range missiles that the Ukrainians are permitted to use to strike deep inside Moscow or deep inside Russia. It's hard to overstate what an escalation that is. The only thing short of doing that, to providing weapons, missiles, long-range missiles that can be used to strike deep inside Russia, which obviously the Russians understand and know is being authorized and funded and fueled by the United States and their NATO allies, is sending combat troops to go fight the Russian army in Ukraine. That's pretty much all that's left. Do you feel comfortable assuming the risks of whatever might happen by having Western weapons and missiles landing in Moscow or in St. Petersburg or deep inside Russia, all over Ukraine? The risks that obviously produces. The New York Times goes on, quote, the issue, which has long been debated in the White House, is coming to a head on Friday with the first visit to Washington by Britain's new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Britain has already signaled to the United States that it is eager to let Ukraine use its, quote, Storm Shadow long-range missiles to strike at Russian military targets far from the Ukrainian border. But the British, being little poodles in the United States, want explicit permission from Mr. Biden in order to demonstrate a coordinated strategy with the United States and France, which makes a similar missile. American officials say Mr. Biden has not made a decision, but we'll hear from Mr. Starmer on Friday. Every time this has happened, these kind of articles, Biden poised to now do X, whereas X was previously off the table when it comes to Ukraine. Always a test balloon to make sure that there was no unexpected opposition. There never is. And then Biden eventually announces that that's exactly what's going to happen. If you are Vladimir Putin and the British are saying we're going to supply the Ukrainians with long-range missiles and tell them to use them to strike deep inside Russia, why would you not take your own long-range missiles and strike deep inside London and in the UK? Why would one major country allow this puny little twerpy country, the UK, to enable deep inside your own country of Russia to be attacked with their missiles and then not do anything back to the British and to NATO generally, and of course the United States? That's the game that's being played all over Ukraine. Reuters today says, quote, Putin says that the West will be fighting directly with Russia if it lets Kiev use long-range missiles. Can that be any clearer? Quote, President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday that the West would be directly fighting with Russia if it allowed Ukraine to strike Russian territory with Western-made long-range missiles, a move he said would alter the nature and scope of the conflict. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has been pleading with Kiev's allies for months to let Ukraine fire Western missiles, including long-range U.S. ATACMS and British Storm Shadows deep into Russian territory to limit Moscow's ability to launch attacks. In some of his most hawkish statements, comments on the subject yet, this is hawkish from Putin, but not from the West. In some of his most hawkish comments on the subject yet, Putin said such a move would drag the country supplying Kiev with long-range missiles directly into the war, since satellite targeting data and the actual programming of the missiles flight paths would have to be done by NATO military personnel because Kiev does not have the capabilities itself. Quote, so this is not a question of allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is a question of deciding whether or not NATO countries are directly involved in a military conflict, Putin told Russian state TV. Imagine what would happen if China said, we're giving long-range missiles to Venezuela and Cuba with the explicit purpose of telling them that they can use those to strike deep into American territory. Do you think we might hold China or Russia responsible if they did that? Probably we would. Certainly we would. There's no question we would. And by hold them responsible, I mean we would consider that a war not being launched and waged solely or even primarily by Venezuela and Cuba, but instead by the powers backing them and giving those weapons, giving those missiles to those countries with the specific intent that they use them to strike deep into American soil. And while, of course, the pretext is going to be, we're just going to strike Russian military installations, we already seen the Ukrainians launching drone attacks in and near Moscow that struck civilian apartment buildings, that killed Russian civilians, and that's going to happen at an infinitely higher rate when you're talking about these long-range missiles. How long and how much is Russia going to withstand that without escalating the war and holding the West responsible? You're talking about the country with the largest nuclear stockpile. You're talking about a war that is failing, collapsing. And out of this desperation not to suffer the humiliation of losing, we are now on the verge of doing something that the Russians, quite rationally and expectedly, would consider to be the immediate, direct involvement as active belligerents, the United States and NATO allies. Now, inside Ukraine, their view of the war is a lot different than our view in the West, because they're the ones who actually have to fight and die in it and watch their entire country be destroyed. And there's always been a big problem with resistance, with people fleeing and deserting. But as this war has gone on, it's gotten far, far worse, which is only compounding the Ukrainian inability to fight off the Russian army. In The Intercept, which occasionally does still publish a worthwhile article when sort of forced to by outside contributors, on September 11th, the my former colleague at The Intercept, who now is with Just Foreign Policy, which is an outstanding foreign policy advocacy group, Aida Chavez, she published this article in The Intercept about how much worse the problem with Ukrainian desertion is getting. Now, the headline is a headline that I'm sure was chosen by The Intercept, which is, quote, progressives were pilloried for wanting to end the Ukraine war in 2020. Things have only gotten worse. Which progressives were trying to end the war in 2022? Every single member of the Democratic Party, including on the progressive wing, AOC, Bernie, every single one of them, voted to fuel and fund this war and never has raised a single syllable of objection since. There are some people on the left, not the relevant mainstream Democratic Party left, that were opposed to it, but almost all of the opposition to this war has come from the populist right wing of the Republican Party. Those are just facts. I mean, like 6 dozen or 7 dozen Republican House members voted against funding the war in Ukraine, predicting that this would happen. Something like 11 or 12 Republican senators, and that's it. Not a single Democratic member of Congress ever did. But leave that aside. As I said, I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that that is a Intercept headline designed to not appear to be defending the right, the worst sin there is. And then it says, well, quote, with tens of thousands more killed and Ukraine's leverage tanking, the quickly withdrawn House Democrats' letter is proving prescient. So I understand what this is referring to, but let's focus on the part about the unwillingness of Ukraine to fight, not which side gets credit, because I just set out those facts that make that very clear. Quote, during the fall of 2022, Western support for defending Ukraine was achieving results that few had thought possible. A successful Ukrainian counteroffensive had pushed Russia out of Kharkiv, and it was on the verge of being forced out of Kherson too. The successes were so rousing that President Joe Biden began to worry about Russia getting desperate and the potential risk of a nuclear escalation. In private remarks at a fundraiser, Biden reportedly said that the risk of nuclear, quote, Armageddon was the highest it had been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. After news of those comments broke, 30 progressive Democrats issued a letter echoing Biden's concerns and urging the administration to pair support for Ukraine's successes with, quote, a proactive Democratic push to seek a ceasefire. The signatories were unequivocal that they supported Biden's commitment to Ukraine. A draft of the letter had even come in for criticism from the grassroots support of diplomacy for its staunch support for sending billions of arms to Ukraine. It all seemed very reasonable, especially amid talk of nuclear war. The lawmakers were torn to shreds simply for saying, we still support the war in Ukraine, we still want to fund it, we just would like to have you start also pursuing a diplomatic resolution, given that Joe Biden himself has said that the risk of nuclear Armageddon has never been higher as a result of this war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the U.S. came very close with Russia, the Soviet Union, to blowing up the entire world and extinguishing humanity forever. The article goes on, quote, today, however, the war is stuck. The momentum has shifted and tens of thousands more Ukrainians and Russians have lost their lives, and even members of the foreign policy establishment are coming to realize it. In 2022, the progressives had been pilloried and cowed. Today, they look more prescient than ever. Again, I strongly resist this idea that the prescient warnings about the war in Ukraine were coming from progressives, just because a few of them, a couple dozen, wrote a letter saying, we support the war in Ukraine, keep funding it, keep fueling it, just please try and see if you can get a diplomatic resolution. The only real opposition from the start has come from where I said it came, but the more important part here is that I do think parts of the foreign policy community are starting to recognize what a complete disaster this has been, which is completely predictable given all the people we've had on our show, from John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs from the start, and so many others who have laid out exactly what would happen here. I mean, I remember 2.5 years ago, John Mearsheimer saying Ukraine is going to be left as a rump state. The Russians are going to absolutely do whatever they have to grab as much of their territory as possible. They had 20%, they have 25%. And he said it's just going to be a rump state as a buffer zone between Russia and the West and not a functioning state. A video emerged where this interviewer, Mikhail Zygar, interviewed Victoria Nuland, who used to be Dick Cheney's top foreign policy advisor, then ran Ukraine for Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, and now runs Ukraine for Joe Biden. The only time she was out of power was when Donald Trump was in office. She's now left the government, I think in part because she didn't get the promotion she wanted. She wanted to be Secretary of State. It didn't look like she was going to get it, so she's out for now. But she's still the architect, one of the main architects, not only of the war in Ukraine, but also the 10-year earlier coup that led to the ousting of the democratically elected president who was too close to Moscow in the view of Victoria Nuland, and replaced by somebody she chose who the U.S. could more control. And she's asked here about reports that at the very start there were active, robust negotiations between the Ukrainians and Russians to resolve this before it became this war. And that the UK under Boris Johnson, especially the US as well, intervened and put a stop to those negotiations to make sure that this war continued instead and wasn't peacefully resolved. And here's what she said when asked.
There was a story first told by former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett that both sides were really close to the end, to the successful end of the negotiations, and then Prime Minister Boris Johnson interfered and stopped prevented Ukrainians from signing the deal. And then Ukrainian Representative Arahami kind of confirmed it, that yes, he said in an interview that there was some kind of advice from Boris Johnson to stop negotiating and to win this war militarily. Where is the myth? Where is the truth?
I mean, look at that nauseating grin, but I just want to make clear what that question was. He wasn't just asking, hey, by the way, were there some negotiations that you stopped? He was citing extremely knowledgeable firsthand sources, such as the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Naftali Bennett, and even high-level members of the Ukrainian parliament who have said publicly there was a ton of progress between Moscow and Kiev early in the war, February and March, where essentially Ukraine would agree not to seek NATO membership. It would provide a sort of semi-autonomous zone in the eastern part of Ukraine, as well as in Crimea, where, by the way, the people of Crimea, the people in eastern Ukraine, identify far more with Russia than they do with the Zelensky government in Ukraine. And that essentially would assuage Russia's concerns without having the Ukrainians face a destruction of a generation of men by dying in a war and the destruction of their country and leaving it as a rump state. So there's people who with very reliable knowledge who have said explicitly that that was happening and that it was the British and Americans who intervened and put a stop to those negotiations. And that's what, as she sits there and grins, this is what the interviewer asked for, and here's what she said.
Here's the truth.
Relatively late in the game, the Ukrainians began asking for advice on where this thing was going. And it became clear to us, clear to the Brits, clear to others, that Putin's main condition was buried in an annex to this document that they were working on. Mm-hmm. And it included limits on the precise kinds of weapon systems that Ukraine could have after the deal, such that Ukraine would basically be neutered as a military force. And
now, let me just say, she's saying that, first of all, notice here that the whole premise, the conceit of that entire answer is, oh, the Ukrainians were really dumb. They thought like they had a chance to make a deal with Russians, but we, their masters in London and Washington, we saw something they didn't understand, that buried in this appendix was the real Putin goal, namely that he wanted to limit the amount of weapons that were present on Ukrainian soil, precisely because the West has long been saying that they're going to make Ukraine part of NATO. The West changed their government in Kiev, right on the other side of the most sensitive border. And in case you think that that's some kind of unprecedented condition, the reason the Cuban Missile Crisis happened is because the Cuban government, after the failed Bay of Pigs operation in 1961 to overthrow the Castro government, which the CIA led and failed to accomplish, wanted security against future U.S. attempts to invade and engineer a coup. And so they asked the Soviet Union, will you put nuclear weapons in our country as protection against U.S. invasions? And the Soviet Union did. had nuclear submarines around Cuba. That was what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about. The United States said, we will absolutely not accept the presence of these weapons in a country 90 miles from our southernmost border in Florida. And not only did that almost lead to a war, it almost led to a nuclear war. It was just a matter of luck that it didn't. Just to give you a sense for how dangerous these things can spiral. So of course the Ukrainians don't want extremely threatening weapons, because the Russians rather, in Ukraine, because of what is happening now. Namely that they now have very sophisticated long-range missiles that they're now being given the green light to shoot deep into Russian territory. And I assume those were negotiable, those limits. Those limits are all over the place. We obviously don't allow certain kinds of weapons to be in certain countries where we feel threatened by it. We do that all the time. But the idea that she would sit there so smugly and be like, yeah, we did. They asked our advice. They didn't ask her advice. They knew that they had to do what they were told by Washington and Britain, because that's who was going to fund them and arm them and protect them. There wasn't an equal relationship. They had to do what they were told. And the message from London and Washington is she's admitting, while she smirks, is like, yeah, we looked at this deal and we're like, no, you can't do that. You're going to have to let your country go up in flames. Sorry, this is not a deal we can accept.
There were no similar constraints on Russia. Russia wasn't required to pull back. Russia wasn't required to have a buffer zone from the Ukrainian border, wasn't required to have the same constraints on its military facing Ukraine. And so people inside Ukraine and people outside Ukraine started asking questions about whether this was a good deal, and it was at that point that it fell apart.
It fell apart because people inside Ukraine, the ones who were asking the advice, also she said people outside Ukraine, meaning me, the master of Ukraine, she's sitting there smirking over the fact that she sabotaged a peace deal that, had it been permitted to go forward, not only would have saved hundreds of billions of dollars in American money, which no one cares about, just keep pouring that into Raytheon and General Dynamics and Boeing, that's what it's for, but also would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives of both young Russian men and young Ukrainian men, would have averted the complete destruction of Ukraine, what will be the reconstruction of it through JP Morgan and BlackRock and a whole bunch of other vulture funds that will profiteer off it at the expense of the American taxpayer as usual. She's proud of the fact that she intervened with Boris Johnson to veto any negotiations. She wanted that war to go forward. She desperately wanted it. And they admit it now. They say that, look, this is a great war for us. We haven't had to sacrifice a single one of our soldiers, a single one of our citizens. We're just forcing Ukrainians to die. And if they don't want to fight, we're taking them at gunpoint. We're putting them in prison. We're threatening to execute them if they desert. They're the only ones who are dying, so it's great for us, and we get to weaken Russia at the same time, even though Russia's not actually being weakened. So this should forever end any doubt about this obviously truthful historical narrative, that the reason why this war wasn't diplomatically resolved at the beginning was because Victoria Nuland and Boris Johnson vetoed it because they knew they weren't going to be the ones who suffered. Instead, they were going to be the ones who benefited. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.